In 1795, Ludwig von Beethoven made his public debut in Vienna. The British Navy made the drinking of lemon juice mandatory to prevent scurvy. A young, up-and-coming artillery officer by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte was promoted to Commander of the Army of the Interior after squashing a royalist rebellion in Paris. And in the small Herefordshire village of Fownhope, a boy by the name of Thomas Winter was born. In 1817, a great benefit was held in the Fives Court for Joshua Hudson, a boxer who'd fallen upon hard times, and the talk of the town was that for the first time in many years the great Cribb was to attend. Accompanying him was a young man of very fine appearance, tall and slim but well built. He made no attempt to introduce himself, but simply sat with the champion throughout the evening. But as the proceedings drew to a close, Jack Stringer, a large, burly horse trader, pushed his way into the ring, and despite the protestations of Paddington Jones, the master of ceremonies, he offered a challenge to any man present to beat him. As he spoke, he looked directly at Cribb, who simply smiled and turned to the young man at his side, raising his eyebrows in an unspoken challenge. The young man grinned and stood. He slipped through the ropes, and once in the ring, stripped to the waist. Suddenly the gossip started afresh. He was uncommonly well-muscled and obviously in fine fitness. He had the build of a fighter, but no one knew who he was. On Jones's command, he raised his guard and advanced on his opponent. Rarely in the history of pugilism has such a one-sided fight been seen. Cribb's companion was light on his feet, agile and fast. His hands were quick and accurate, and hardly had his opponent moved before he was struck square in the face. He bellowed a roar of indignation and charged at the young man, but he found nothing but another well-timed blow for his trouble. The fight continued in much the same manner, with the youngster striking seemingly at will, and his older, heavier opponent not managing to land a single blow. His punches were not powerful, but quantity has a quality all of its own, and soon the fight was his. As the famous Paddington Jones acclaimed him the winner, the crowd called out, "Who is he?" and a chant began. It would seem that Jones was in on the secret, because he raised the young man's hand and shouted, "Young Spring!" It was clearly a name picked to remind people of his agile manner in the ring, but it stuck from that night, and Tom Spring, one of the most technically proficient fighters to stand in the ring, had made his mark in London, and few could have guessed to what heights he would later rise. Born Tom Winter in a small town outside Hereford, Spring, as we shall refer to him from now on, was always destined for great things. At the age of 12 he signed himself up as a drummer boy to go and fight against the devil Bonaparte on the continent. Perhaps as a sign of the genetic makeup of the family, Spring's father, upon hearing this, headed out to find the recruiting sergeant and beat him bloody for trying to steal children without their parents' knowledge. Young Tom found himself back in the family farm learning the business of a farmer. Not long after, he ran away again, this time to sign up as a crew member on a coal barge, but after several months of poor treatment he swallowed his pride and headed back home. Always a feisty fighter, the first we hear of Spring coming to the attention of the fancy was at a dance. Spring, always popular with the ladies, had been paying too much attention to a particularly attractive young woman, much to the annoyance of the man who had brought her. He stood well over 6 feet tall and had the build of a manual worker, and he was used to getting his own way through intimidation. But Spring, despite being smaller and more lightly built, was not one to be bullied. A quarrel ensued, and soon the pair came to blows. George Cooper and Sam Robinson, both professional fighters, who were working with a travelling fair, intervened and persuaded the pair to wait until the morning and save their anger for the ring. We have no details of the fight, save that it lasted for 15 rounds, and Spring came through unscathed, but his opponent was half blinded by the damage inflicted to his face. The two celebrated pugilists attempted to persuade Spring to accompany them to the capital, as they were so impressed with his natural ability, but his mother was ill, so he refused. Cooper was particularly impressed and told both Tom Cribb, the reigning champion, and also George Head, a promoter and trainer, about the young man he'd encountered in Hereford. Head was about to leave with his own travelling fare, and due to Cooper's enthusiasm, he determined to visit Hereford to see for himself. By the time Head's company reached Spring's home, his mother had sadly died, and Spring's desire to travel and see the world was reasserting itself. He packed his bags and signed up as a novice. During their travels, they met up with Cribb, who struck up a firm friendship with the youth and invited him to stay with him in London. When the company disbanded, Spring took Cribb up on his offer, and not long after, appeared at his side at the benefit we mentioned earlier. Together, Cribb and Spring, who were firm friends by this point, tried to arrange a rematch with Stringer, but he was unwilling to suffer the same fight again until Spring's fame began to grow. He finally agreed to fight for the sum of 15 guineas, but on Cribb's advice, the offer was refused as being beneath him. With the backing of Captain Barclay, the sum was increased to 40 guineas, and the fight was on. Little was made of it to the general public, but amongst the fancy there was much excitement, and a great number of the aristocracy found themselves at Moleseyhurst watching a man outclassed. The fight lasted 29 rounds, and Spring won every one of them. Cribb announced to all who could listen that a future champion had made his name that day. The fancy agreed, and Tom Spring had no shortage of backers for his next fight. The man Spring had his eye on for his next fight was a seasoned professional by the name of Ned Painter, who, by a coincidence, had been involved in a fracas where he struck Spring's younger brother. Spring had taken it personally and put up 40 guineas of his own money on a challenge. Cribb added 60 more of his own, and when Painter found his own backer, the fight was agreed for 1 week's time, allowing no time for training. The fight started the moment the two men entered the ring, but a great cry rang out through the hall, and on realising their mistake, the pair stopped, laughed, and Painter offered his hand to the challenger to shake. With a grin and an exaggerated bow, Spring again drew his fists, and the fight began for the second time. The first round was a cagey affair, with neither fighter seemingly willing to commit themselves, but Painter was the first to make his move. He stepped in with a powerful blow, but Spring slipped the blow and countered with a straight jab that landed directly on Painter's nose. It was nothing more than a light tap, but it set Painter afire and he charged in with arms milling. Spring matched the increase in pace, and with marvellous rapidity he rained blow after blow on Painter, who eventually fell to one particularly well-timed punch. However, on his way to the ground, he struck his head against one of the wooden posts. The fight was almost called at that point, but Painter was made of tough stuff, and he made it back up to scratch. It was clear, though, that something was amiss, and it's great credit to Painter that he managed to draw the fight out as long as he did. Every round looked like the last, but again and again Painter would totter back to the line, and the fight would begin once more. But even with this advantage, it took a full 31 rounds for Spring to claim the win. But claim the win he did. Painter's supporters were unhappy with the result and immediately demanded a rematch. Painter, however, had had his fill of fighting and retired from the ring. Shortly afterwards, however, an article appeared in the press suggesting that he had thrown the match. He was so enraged that he immediately returned to London and headed to Spring's rooms. Spring assured him that he would do everything in his power to help him reclaim his good name, and with Cribb's backing and the backing of the fancy, the two agreed to fight again, this time for no money that had not come from their own pockets. The second fight was considerably longer than their first, and this time Painter emerged the victor in the 41st round. He'd cleared his name, but he had also effectively derailed Spring's claim to the championship. Had Painter stuck with the profession, it's certain that he would have become champion himself, but he'd only returned to the ring to clear his name, and he immediately retired once more and moved to Norwich, where he settled down as the landlord of the Lobster Inn. With Spring discredited in the eyes of many, and Cribb refusing to fight for less than 1,000 guineas, the championship was effectively empty with no clear successor. One man, however, thought himself up to the job, and Jack Carter announced to the world that he was indeed the champion. When Cribb was asked how he felt about this, he simply replied that he would see when Carter eventually made it to London. Carter did make it to London, and he was introduced to the crowds at the Fives Court as the real champion of England. But his smile faded when he saw Cribb walk across the room and climb into the ring. After much showmanship, Cribb announced to Carter and the crowds that he had a promising young man who disputed Carter's claim to the title, and Spring joined them in the ring. There and then the pair agreed to fight, and a date was set for May that year. Nobility travelled from all across Europe to watch the match, and they were treated to one of the longest fights in the history of the ring. Spring had spent his time away from the ring in training with Cribb, and he was more skilled than ever, but despite having the measure of his man, the fight lasted no less than 71 rounds. Spring, however, refused to claim the title, despite his having wrested that claim from Carter, though his reputation was now restored, and his path to glory seemed clear. Spring beat Ben Byrne and Tom Oliver, both serious contenders themselves, and when Cribb finally announced his retirement from the ring, Spring claimed the title for his own. He stood in the ring at Cribb's side and said, "Gentlemen, my old dad, as I am proud to call him, has retired from the stage and the prize ring altogether. And as I have stood next to him for some time past, I now mean to stand in his place until I am beaten out of it."